I want to introduce our final guest, who knows better than anyone what it's like to be a young creative. Ron Howard appeared in his first film at just 18 months old. He became a star in the Andy Griffith Show when he was 6, and then he later moved on, of course, to a starring role in Happy Days. From legendary films like Apollo 13, The Da Vinci Code, A Beautiful Mind, and most recently Solo, Ron Howard is one of the most renowned filmmakers of our time. Please, let's roll a video of his work.
Andy Griffith tells me that he remembers my saying that I wanted to be a director a long time ago. He says that my pat answer to what do you want to do when you grow up always was, I want to be an actor, writer, producer, director, cameraman, baseball player.
Pimps? Are you saying we should become pimps?
What did you do?
Nothing, I stirred the text.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we have a problem. And the Oscar goes to A Beautiful Mind. Brian Grazer, Ron Howard produces.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Academy Award-winning director, Ron Howard. Yay,
Hey.
it's Ron Howard. Yay.
Hello.
It's very exciting. All right, I already got over my excitement because I already met him. So we just celebrated the work of young creators and talked about the importance of mentorship. You obviously started your career very early.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're going to pull up a picture of you from Happy Days that was actually shot by Albert Watson, who was just out here. And they just had a little kind of get-together, having not seen each other in 4 years.
Yeah.
And so...
Well, he also shot the poster for Da Vinci Code, so that wasn't
he
so long
did?
ago. Yes.
Okay, so it's a small world.
Yeah.
So maybe tell us a little bit about how you got your start, your early years, and then maybe if any mentors played a big role in your career.
My father was the primary mentor, and of course, along the way, there were many others that were incredibly, inspiring. But the story of my mom and dad is a sort of its own kind of immigrant story. They came out of the Depression era, Midwest, Oklahoma and Kansas. Somehow, they both had this dream of show business without having any connections whatsoever. They met at Oklahoma University and ran away with a children's theater troupe, and I'm sure just terrified their parents because they got married at 19 out there on the road. You know, it was just, and they followed this remarkable dream. And my father, who passed away last year at 89, worked up until about a day or so before he was taken ill. He worked his entire life, and while never becoming the big star, he had a big, long, wonderful career in the business. But he also directed theater. And when I was very young, he was doing summer stock, and they began to see that around age 3, I was picking up on the dialogue and starting to imitate it. He thought that was kind of funny, so we put together this scene that was supposed to be between 2 adults. You know, it was from Mr. Roberts. I was playing the Jack Lemmon part. He would play the Henry Fonda part. And he went in for an audition in New York, and it was swarming with kids, and he left a note, and he said, by the way, Rance Howard dropped by, but my son, Ronnie, is a very fine actor. And he kind of thought it was just a joke, you know, and they said, bring him in. I went in and I did this scene for Mr. Roberts. They thought that was good. They said, can he do anything else? And he said, my dad said, I have no idea if he can. But I learned a scene, got this part. Because it was going to be filmed in Vienna, Austria, and my parents were so poor, they thought this is going to be our only chance to go to Europe, and we can take this little bit of money and make a college fund for him. Wow. But I remember, I just turned 4 by the time we started shooting this movie. It was called The Journey. I loved it. I really remember so much about it. It was like a playground to me. And in those early days, those first jobs, I started working then in live television and things like that. And it was the magic. It was seeing a swimming pool that looked deep, and my dad sticking his finger down and seeing that it was only like 3 inches deep. It was painted that way. And I began to be sort of enthralled by the storytelling. And finally, I did a show, and Ronald Reagan was the host. It was for General Electric Theater. And even though I didn't have much of a credit, at the end he said, and little special thanks to little Ronnie Howard, who played Barnaby and Mr. O'Malley. And the next day, the producers of the Andy Griffith Show called and said, we saw that would be great, he should be Andy's son, and I got that part, which really, and Andy became a great mentor. I had so many, George Lucas and Jerry Paris from Happy Days and Gary Marshall, many others. And, but that was really the beginning. But the audacity of my parents to actually think that they could make their way in this business, and they really did it.
That's an amazing story. Okay, you have done so many amazing projects. We saw just a glimpse of all of your work. So where do you get your inspiration from?
Well, it's sort of a chemical thing. I mean, I think it's an immediate, it's from emotion. I have an emotional reaction to an idea or a subject. Maybe it's the world. Maybe it's the kind of people who they are, the way that they're being tested. I'll have a reaction to that. That is followed almost immediately with fascination and curiosity. And then I begin to imagine my sensibility applied to this story. And if I begin to think there's something of myself that's organic that I can bring to this, whatever the tone, I like to work in a lot of different genres and styles, but it's all about the thematics of that story. And I've developed my voice, my capacity to be able to work in different genres and apply the best genre to the thematics that speak to me. But it's one of the reasons that I then became fascinated by true stories. Apollo 13 was the first one, and up to that point, I'd been terrified to do true stories. But then I had worked with Tom Hanks. He was very interested in it, loved space. He was all about delving into the details of it, striving for authenticity. That was a great collaboration that really meant a lot to me. And I take great creativity, creative inspiration from my collaborators, writers, actors, cinematographers, producers. But as we went along, we cut the movie together. It was a fascinating experience. It was incredibly challenging, daunting experience, even though I was well into my movie directing career at that point. Then we start test screening the movie. And, boy, people loved it. But there was no marketing. Nobody had any idea what it was. It was just this movie that we were testing. And you have the screenings, and people fill out cards, and they tell you what they think of it. And, boy, the test scores were just fantastic. I was elated, except there was one poor. They do excellent, very good, good, fair, poor. Only one out of 422 people. Come on. So, of course, that's the one I have to find. So I dig around, and I find it. And it's a 23-year-old Caucasian male who just hates it. Terrible. Wouldn't recommend it. Boring. Awful. All these, these big, bold pencil marks. Finally, you flip it over in the back, and it says, please give us your thoughts about any comments about the ending. And he puts, terrible. More Hollywood bullshit. They would never survive. And I realized this is why you do a true story. I mean, he didn't know it was a true story, but because and so in terms of the fascination and that inspiration and the possibility and the ways in which human beings can rise to the occasion and deal with tests or fail to rise to the occasion, well, that's to me the supreme drama. And to apply everything I learned in fiction to these kinds of stories has turned out to be something I'm excited about.
There is. So everybody in the audience loves to hear about creative process. Right. So can you share a little bit about your creative process?
Well, for me, it has really become one of collaboration. I love to be at the center of the creative swirl and engage with a lot of brilliant people, whether they're in front of the camera or they're the designers, writers, editors, composers behind the camera. And I sometimes, when I did the movie The Paper, which was about journalism, I realized, well, I kind of function almost like an editor-in-chief. However, I always have my own ideas that I develop on my own, but with my own relationship with the material, really as a foundation and a jumping off place. But I think all of that was really born on the Andy Griffith Show, which was it looks loose and easy. I mean, that show's never been off the air since 1960, which is just unbelievable. And I think the reason is because it was such a unique, specific, creative enterprise. It really reflected Andy's youth and his understanding of the South and his own sense of humor. And while he wasn't the writer or the producer, he brought to it a kind of specificity and integrity. And I think when that works and clicks, that's where you get your enduring stories, and whether it's a movie or television or music or whatever it might be. But it was also very, very collaborative. And I had the opportunity, I mean, that series began when I was 6 years old. And I would be able to go to our read-throughs, our cast read-throughs, and afterwards there'd always be a half an hour where the actors were allowed to contribute their ideas, raise their questions, critique it, whatever it might be. And I got to see this sort of creative problem solving. And I found that inspiring, even as a kid. And I remember even daring in that first season when I was 6 years old to try to make a couple of thoughts, to give up a couple of ideas. Nothing ever was, they didn't like them, and kind of pissed me off, I remember. And then I will never forget, it was the second episode of the second season. I had just turned 7 years old, and my job, we were rehearsing, this was not shooting, was to come into the courthouse like I always did and said, hey, Pa, and Andy and Otis and Barney were sort of over here on the other side, not in their wardrobe, just holding the scripts, rehearsing. And the director had me come in, and I came in and I said, hey, Pa, and then I said the line that was, I don't know what the line was, and then I stopped, and I kind of raised my hand, and the director, Bob Sweeney, who had also been an actor, as were most of the directors on the Andy Griffith Show, which was another inspiration, he said, what is it, Ronnie? And I said, well, I don't think a kid would say it that way. And he said, how do you think a kid would say it? And I pitched my rewrite. And he thought about it and said, good, say it that way. Here, let's do it. And I was just stunned to be a part of it. And I remember Andy saying from across the courtroom, he says, what are you grinning at, young'un? He really did talk that way in those days. And I said, well, that's the first idea of mine you've taken. And he said, well, it was the first one that was any damn good. Now let's rehearse the scene. And so I grew up in a thing where there was this energy around the creative problem solving. And you asked earlier, so to me there's this fascination, there's this sense that I can connect, and then there's this incredible excitement for the process of collaboration, digging deeper, understanding more, and trying to realize the potential of any story.
That's great. And I mean, the way creativity now is across every discipline, of course, filmmaking is, it's very collaborative. And I think technology has really helped enable that. So I was going to ask you a question. So obviously Adobe's a software company.
Right.
How have technology, visual effects kind of influenced your work?
Well, it's just incredibly liberating. I mean, it's just wonderful to be able to dream something and not then, which is what you used to have to do, kind of go through a process of knowing that you're never going to quite realize it, And now with digital technology and and new gear with greater range and durability, you really can get your ideas, out there onto the screen. It's also, I find it faster and easier. I'm less tired at the end of making a movie now at my age than I was 30 years ago. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I'm not as tense because it's easier to keep exploring and experimenting. So there's not quite as much weight on every single decision because you can carry the exploration on with you.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned your age, and so you are a great age, and so please don't.
64, let's just say it.
Hey, 64. You know, the
This is my
Beatles.
60th year in the business, by the way, if you go back to
It's
age
crazy.
4 when I started.
It's crazy. You once said there are creative benefits to getting older.
Right.
So tell us about that.
Well, absolutely, but there are first the experience, of course, and the sort of the subsets of individuals, ideas, concepts that you're going to come into contact with in your work and in your life that you begin to understand and interpret. But I think the greatest thing is there's a kind of a diminishment of fear. It's not gone, but it's diminished. And in the beginning, of course, you have the blessing of ignorance, and you kind of think everything you do is probably going to be pretty great. Once you develop the confidence, and that was one thing I wanted to get across, by the way, speaking of creativity, one of the things you have to do is someone has to help you understand early on in your life, as happened to me, that your creativity has value. You're not wasting your time dreaming. You're not wasting your time playing around with creative ideas. In fact, you're exercising an aspect of the human experience that all of us have, a strength and a power, and you're beginning to build on it. And maybe it'll be your profession, or maybe it'll only help you in the problem solving of your life, but it's really important. Once you have that, and you have that confidence, then there's that ignorance. Then the reality sets in. If you make it your career and your business, of course, you're going to face a lot of disappointment, and it hurts like hell. And that's something that you have to get by. And then if you stay with it long enough, and you have the fortune to keep being invited to the party and allowed to work and be productive, you begin to fear that less. You're not fearing total loss or destruction anymore. You're fearing irritation if something doesn't go well, a bummer. But it's not going to destroy you because you've got the calluses of experience to carry you through.
Oh, that's a wonderful way to think about it. So you've won, countless awards, Oscars, Emmys, Golden Globes. But what measures of success would you say are most meaningful to you?
Well, I really do have to like the thing first myself. Mm-hmm. So I feel like I'm the first audience member.
You're the first critic.
And so to feel really great about something for the rest of my life, I'm going to have to always feel that I put my best foot forward and we achieve what I hope to achieve, and that I like it. When I see it, I like the way it laid down. Audience means a lot. The Andy Griffith Show was never critically supported. Neither was Happy Days. So I grew up on shows that were wildly popular, but there was always this disconnect with critics. So while we all love to be lauded by critics, and it means a lot to the projects that we do, and it hurts when it doesn't happen, believe me, it really is, to me, that connection I have with the audience. And I always feel that I can't control the outcome of a project in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. But the one thing I can control is its ability to speak to the audience that I think it's intended to speak to, mm-hmm. in a useful way. Whether that means it was diverting and hilarious and fun, or it was thought-provoking, or it was scary, whatever it was supposed to achieve, the way it was supposed to stimulate the audience. If I've done it, that feels very, very good. And it's interesting now to also have these voices on the internet. Mm-hmm. They're very particular because you have to think about who are the people who will take the time to do that. That's a particular subset, but it's interesting. And I do.
So you look at IMDb.
I look at it. I look at them.
Rotten
yeah,
Tomatoes.
I scan them. Sometimes I wince. Sometimes I smile. But I scan them. However, look. This happened with this movie I had, Solo, where the franchise was sort of attacked, and then I talked to some people who really know their way around, and they said, well, it doesn't take that many people to focus an attack. Then you factor in the possibility of bots. I mean, I don't know. They were saying Russian bots piled on. I don't know whether that's true or not, but there is a risk, and now I question the ratings on a lot of movies. So as a consumer, I'm not so sure what to make of those now that I've sort of had this other experience where I know there was a huge disconnect between the way test audiences, exit polls rated the movie and the way it was being rated on the internet. And so, look, those are great programs. I love them as a consumer, and I appreciate them as a creator. It'd be great if the more they could validate, and work against that. It would be great.
So you're teaching a class. You're teaching a class about directing. So what have you learned, and what advice do you have for filmmakers in the audience? And maybe you can also give us a little glimpse of what you're working on next.
Sure. Well, look, as far as advice goes, and I have a feeling this group is far ahead of this, you have to dream. I think you want to study the medium that you're most interested in, but I would also hasten to say that at this moment, and it's a really exciting time creatively. It's a great time to be a creator, but I think it's sort of a mistake to narrow in on one medium. I think it's about storytelling, at least based on my work and what I do, and I think that as you begin to see how your narrative instincts, your thematic instincts, the subjects you're drawn to, how they can apply to the various mediums, from theater through short form, through branded content, through big screen experiences, or novels, whatever it might be. I think that's it. And then most of all is to work and get back to trusting your creativity and trusting that you're making a good investment when you really throw your shoulder in something. I had a chance to work with a lot of the greatest actors, just out of good fortune. John Wayne I acted with, Henry Fonda, these all-time greats. I directed Bette Davis, and in fact, I directed Bette Davis
when you were 10?
Well, I was 20. I was like 24, and
wow.
She really loved this part. It was a television movie called Skyward. It was a great role. She was in her mid-70s, still smoking those unfiltered Camels, but showing up on time, knowing her lines, and I was, but she was tough on me because I was this guy from a sitcom, and she was worried about me. She wanted the role. And every time I would talk to her on the phone, without meeting her, but leading up to the production, I'd give her some insight into what we were doing, or tell her I was sending her some rewrites, and she would say, oh, well, that's fine, Mr. Howard. And I said, well, Miss Davis, please just call me Ron. And she said, I will call you Mr. Howard until I decide whether I like you or not, and hung up. And so now I'm terrified, and and I'm tossing and turning in the night and sweating. And my father, the longtime character actor, he said, she's great, and she's been great her whole career. And the greats want leadership. Mm-hmm. So as much as I love to collaborate, mm-hmm. I've also learned early on you have to lead. Mm. And he said, don't be afraid to direct her. So day one, I'm directing her. And she's doing some kind of physical thing that isn't quite making sense. It's a cockpit of an airplane that is supposed to look like she's upside down, but I don't think she quite gets it. And so anyway, we're shooting, and I walk up to her and start to explain to her. It's the first time I'm giving her a direction, and she goes like this, ah, oh! And then loud enough for the whole crew to hear, she says, oh my God, I saw this child walking up to me. And of course, I had to wonder, what is this? What of any importance could this child possibly have to say to me? And I went, and she laughed. The big Bette Davis laughed, ha 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 ha. And so I kind of laughed, ha ha ha, and gave her the direction, and went away and started popping Tums. But she did it, And later on in the day, there was another thing that was a little trickier. She was making an exit. It was kind of awkward on the wrong line of dialogue. And I went up and I said, Miss Davis, I think that's looking a little bit awkward. And I think you should leave a line later and try turning around on the way out. And I gave her, and she said, oh, no, that'll never work. And I said, well, just try it in a rehearsal and just see if it works, if you don't mind. She said, of course, I'll try. I'm a professional. I'm the director's kid. And she did it, and it worked for her. And she turned right around and she said, that's better. Thanks. Let's roll it. And we did it. And so at the end of that day, I said, 4 o'clock or so, I said, well, Miss Davis, you're wrapped for the day. Great first day. Thank you. I'll see you tomorrow. And she said, okay, Ron, see you tomorrow. and,
That's awesome.
and patted me on the ass. I'm not kidding you.
Wow.
But the thing but she worked so hard on that, and the thing that I learned from all of them, and the lesson I tried to take away, and that I would just impart, and it's just so simple, is the greats outwork everybody.
Yeah,
And they don't stop at age 75.
that's awesome. That's the best. You got to write that one down. So I did want to ask you about impact, because you and I talked about it backstage just for a minute.
Well,
It's
you were
something
asking
you're
about
working
teaching.
on.
Yeah, no, I did a master class. That was a blast. They do a great job with that program, and it was. Oh, thank you. It was really. The rest of you sign up, and I get paid for this. So
It's very affordable.
we have a program going at Imagine that Brian Grazer initiated. My partner at Imagine, Brian, which is it's a content acceleration program for writers, and it's our first session. We're calling it Impact, Imagine Impact. We're a little over halfway through, and it is so exhilarating. I'm wearing the hat because I'm going there tonight to be a part of it. But it's we had about 4,200 applicants, narrowed it down to 21 writers.
Wow.
We have shapers who are working with them, people that we know who can really help guide them. And again, it's not grad school. This is a place to take a project and make it viable for the market. It's not for Imagine. We don't control it. We're sponsoring it and hoping to build relationships with great talent through it. But it's really to help offer and create leverage for them, really as entrepreneurs. And it came from Brian Grazer experiencing a Y Combinator session in Silicon Valley and saying, well, every project that we do is a startup.
Wow.
And why not find a way to create a boot camp like that and take our inspiration from that? And it's been really, really thrilling. We already know we're going to do more of them. And so I'm really pleased with a lot of directions that our company, Imagine Entertainment, is going in. But this Impact project is particularly thrilling to be around.
Love it. So before we end, I always like to do a word association.
All right.
Okay? So, so I'm going to give you a word, and
Okay.
you're going to give me only one word back,
Only one word.
if you can do it.
I'll try.
All right. You ready?
Yep.
Okay. Opie.
Boyhood.
Apollo 13.
Adventure.
Creativity.
Wellspring. It means everything to me.
Director.
Leadership.
Ron Howard.
Family man. Well, that's 2 words. Sorry.
It's okay.
2
Two good words. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ron Howard.
Thank you.